I'll explain the evolution of how this book came to be. As you know, I write, or many of you may know that I write a weekly column, and I write about adventures, but I also like to include some historical context and other details, and so I wind up doing a lot of research. If I'm writing about Lantern Hill or Bluff Point or any of those things, there's a lot of source material that I wind up consulting, but it's always sometimes hard to find, and I often find myself saying, gee, I wish there were one clearinghouse of information available. And then I said, well, maybe I should write that book. And as fate would have it, when I had this idea back in January, the Day, as some of you may know, also publishes annually a coffee table style book. Last year we did one on hurricanes and blizzards and other disasters. We've written about the Coast Guard, the Morgan, and so forth. But at the very time back in January, they were just beginning to think, what should we do this year? And I came along and I said, hey, I have an idea. Why don't we write about all the natural areas in the region? And they said, great idea. Let's run with it. And so we're off and running. And I spent the next 6 months along with Dirk Langenfeld, who works at the Day as a marketing editor. And the two of us sort of divvied up what we want to write about. And we were off to the races. And it was a wonderful experience. The hard part, I think, initially was trying to winnow down the number of areas that we wind up focusing on. As many of you know, this is a wonderful area, and there are indeed many, many treasures. We were limited to 144 pages. Within that context, I limited it to about 50 that we wrote about particular, and then maybe 100-odd photographs, and there are many, many more. So I'm hoping that we covered most of the main ones. We wound up focusing on the main state parks, the Bluff Point, the Haley Farm, the Rocky Neck, the Harkness, and so forth. And then also there's a number of land trusts, and they play an important role in this whole conservation process. And part of the reasoning, or part of what I hope to achieve in writing the book, was really to pay tribute and to thank the many volunteers and the organizations that have worked tirelessly for decades to preserve land. This was a notion that was foreign to me when I first moved to this area as a young reporter. I mean, I knew there were parks and I knew there were beaches and so forth, but I really had no idea what went into saving a property like Haley Farm or Bluff Point or Rocky Neck and all those things. So part of what I hope to achieve by writing this book is to offer a tribute to the many organizations and individuals who have worked tirelessly and generously for decades to set aside these really wonderful areas. I'd like to begin with, I wrote a column a couple of weeks ago promoting the book, and I started with I teased people with a little quiz, so I'll test your knowledge here. Which New York fishmonger bought land, now a state park, used as a playground for racing horses and building walls using giant boulders yanked from the ground with a special rock pulling contraption? That's an easy one. I know, Joan, you're ready to jump in, but I heard someone say Haley Farm, of course. Okay, this is another easy one. Where did an angry Satan stamp his cloven feet with such force that he left footprints in the rock? Devil's Hop Yard. Thank you, Bob. This one, I think most of you will get, or many of you. What was renowned ornithologist Roger Torrey Peterson describing when he remarked, I have seen 1 million flamingos on the lakes of East Africa and as many seabirds, I heard someone, on the cliffs of the Alaska Pribilofs. But for sheer drama, this eclipsed any other avian spectacle I have ever seen. Swallows. And we'll get into this in a short while, but if you haven't seen these, put this on your list, and you have to go out there. It's late now, they've already moved on, but if you put this on your list for next late summer, and it's something you'll never forget. Okay, in which river can migrating fish now swim freely for the first time in more than 2 centuries? Pawcatuck. Very good, Pawcatuck River. Just about this time last year, they knocked out the last of dams that had been built for mills and so forth, and they were in place since the time that Washington was president. And now for the first time, fish can migrate 34 miles up from the mouth of the river all the way up to Wharton Pond, 34 miles. Which town has preserved more than half its acreage as open space? It's on the other side of the Thames River. It's west of here. Lyme, very good. Lyme, as you probably know also, is one of the wealthiest communities, but the point I'm like try to make is that it's not something that only rich people can afford, land conservation. And in a lot of ways, it's a very generous gesture on their part because they're not hogging the land just for themselves, but they're opening it up to everyone else by creating these land preserves. And more than half of the property in Lyme is designated as a nature preserve, and more than half the families that live in there also belong to the land trust. Before it was given a unique preservation designation, which state park had once been considered for a variety of development projects, including a steel mill, 1,100 unit, 250 condominium housing development, shipping terminal and container port, 400 boat marina, railroad maintenance yard, warehouses, and underground storage facility for up to 3 million gallons of number 4 heating oil? Nope. Bluff Point, someone said it. Very, very good. Can you imagine that? I mean, Bluff Point is the answer. Bluff Point State Park right here, right down the road. And so before it was designated as a state park, there were various development projects that were considered. And then even after it was designated as a state park, and I'll get into this when we go through the slides, there were also some interesting concepts that were planned. From which promontory can you view at least 4 states? Lantern Hill. And which wildlife, nobody gets this, I didn't know this, which wildlife sanctuary did a Texas cattle rancher donate to the Connecticut Audubon Society? It's in Montville. No one, it's called the Morgan R. Cheney Sanctuary. That's another example. There's a lot of little hidden properties scattered throughout the region that some people don't know about, or some people it's local, but they're all over the place. Which crop are some former dairy farms now growing?
Hops.
Nope. Not hops.
Hemp.
Not hemp. Not yet. I'm sure they probably will before too long. But you're close. It's grapes. Grapes is a big and I'll talk about this shortly too. And the last one, I'll read the question, but I won't give the answer because I don't want to spoil a little fun when you see it on the slide. What did the sign read outside Lyme dairy farmer Jack Tiffany's milking barn? But we'll get to that in a minute. When we began organizing all the material, one of my big concerns was trying to make sure that we had enough photos. After all, this is sort of a picture book, as well as had a lot of text in it. And we sent out, I relied on a lot of the day archives. We have wonderful photographers who take pictures. Dirk and I wound up taking some of our own pictures. Relied on friends and family. But we also send out an appeal to readers, and to our astonishment, we had like 800 images that were sent to us that we sorted through. And so we had quite a nice selection to choose from. And we picked this picture that was taken by a photographer named Steven Sisk from Pawcatuck. And this is Barn Island. And I thought it really said exactly what we're trying to say, that there's a beautiful area, it's open to the public, and it's worthy of its title as one of the true treasures of Southeastern Connecticut. When I say it starts at Bluff Point, it's more of a personal observation, because when I moved to this area in the early 1970s, this was my introduction to the conservation movement, and I met a lot of people, including a woman, which we'll talk about shortly, Sydney Van Zandt, who was involved in the Haley Farm preservation movement. But I was lucky enough to be named to the Bluff Point Advisory Council, which was appointed by the state legislature to draft a bill to decide what to do about Bluff Point. It had just acquired a portion of it, like 600 acres. They purchased another couple hundred acres later on. But they initially had hired an engineering firm to come up with a plan, and their recommendation was basically like a Coney Island. There were going to be Ferris wheels and concession stands. There was going to be a huge 4-lane access road from I-95 that would come all the way down 117, down the middle of Bluff Point, and then at the end there'd be a 6,000 car parking lot. So can you imagine all that? So even after all the other projects that had been considered over the years, where they thought about a park, that was their only concept. And we were able to persuade the legislature to pass a bill that created the first and only coastal reserve in Connecticut. And today Bluff Point remains the largest undeveloped coastal tract between Boston or Cape Cod and New York. And it is indeed the crown jewel of Connecticut State's parks. I've been to probably all the parks in the state. They're all wonderful, but for me, I guess it's more of a personal relationship that I have with Bluff Point. The previous slide, I should have left it up, but anyway, it's the Pawcatuck River, as you know, flows between the airport and the mainland. But there's also a nice little canal that you can sneak through at high tide, and it empties into this salt pond, and that's the pond, incidentally, that they were going to pave over for a 6,000 car parking lot. You're looking north at this point. If you turn around and hiked up to the top of the promontory at the top of the bluff, you'd be overlooking Fisher's Island Sound. But here you're looking north. And if you look to the west, you'd look down the whole peninsula, the Sand Peninsula, and then of course if you reach the top of the bluff, you'd be looking east towards Groton Long Point. Caleb Haley's playground, he was a fishmonger originally from Center Groton, and in the mid-1800s he purchased what was then a working farm, and he was more of a gentleman farmer. He still hired people to raise crops and so forth, but his real passion was building walls and also racing horses. And you can see some of the remnants of his race course on some of the trails there. He trained them there. He raced them down at Pawcatuck Bridge, the Burroughs Field there. But Merritt was the name of the farmer that sort of invented the machine that pulled up these rocks, and they're still standing. Sidney Van Zandt was the one that was involved in helping organize the Groton, well, it was then at the Friends of the Haley Farm, and it evolved in the Groton Open Space Association. I see the president is right here, Joan. Nice to have you here. And but Sidney and Charlie Pratt and Omar Albard and a number of others were involved in this council, and they were also involved in the land preservation movement. The state was going to, actually the government was going to buy and use a big chunk of the farm for housing for the Coast Guard personnel. And that's when the citizens got together and they said, wait a minute, why can't we buy it ourselves and have the state buy it? And so they raised money through rock concerts and bake sales and car washes and raffles and so forth. They came up with the money just in time. And now we have this wonderful park, and the Groton Open Space Association, which evolved from this group, has continued to be a very active organization in preserving land throughout the town here in Groton. Barn Island is about 1,300 acres, and it's, as you know, east of here. It's right on the border of Rhode Island. And this is a state wildlife management area, which is a little bit different animal from the state park. They do allow hunting in season. Initially, when they purchased it, the town had gotten involved in digging these big trenches to drain some of the swamps as part of an insect control program. Then they built these impoundments when they realized that that was interfering with some of the flow. It was kind of one debacle after another, but now it's a wonderful area, and this is a terrific spot. It empties into Little Narragansett Bay. I have Maggie Jones, who's the director of the Nature Center, wrote a wonderful essay describing her relationship with it. Back to Haley Farm, we had Sydney wrote a nice essay about Haley Farm, and also Amby Burfoot, a friend of mine who was the 1968 winner of the Boston Marathon, and Johnny Kelly, who was the 1957 winner of the Boston Marathon and also competed in the 1960 and 64 Olympics. He was the coach, and they would train here, there at Haley Farm. So I had a lot of people writing guest essays in addition to Dirk and I, who also wrote all the other tech essays in the book. The Pawcatuck flows free, as I referred to earlier. When they finally knocked out the last dam, it's the first time that fish can swim freely. One of our photographers, Sean Elliott, took an aerial picture and just happened to, and this is north of Westerly. Most of us think of the Pawcatuck River, we just see this section if we're going over from Pawcatuck into Westerly, and you don't think much about it because it's kind of industrialized there. But farther north, it's wonderful, and also farther south when it empties into Little Narragansett Bay. And now it's under consideration as one of the state's wild and scenic rivers. There's only 2 other, including one here in Lyme, the 8 Mile River. When Sean was there, he just had you see some kayaks in the lower left seam. He just fortuitous timing then. The view from Harkness. Harkness is another wonderful treasure. And when you think about it, you have, as I said, Barn Island to the east, and you go to Bluff Point, and then you have Ocean Beach in New London, and then Harkness, and then East Lyme, and then if you cross over the Connecticut River into Saybrook, they have this new property called the Preserve, which is a huge parcel. So I think the combination of the government and public and private land trusts have done a wonderful job in preserving these natural treasures. Harkness was the gift of the estate of Edward and Mary Harkness back in 1950. They were well-to-do. They earned their money, I believe, from Standard Oil, but they were also great philanthropists, and their estate was one that donated it to the state as a park, and it's a wonderful treasure. Any time of year, my wife Lisa took this picture. It's wonderful in spring with the daffodils, and nice walk along the perimeter overlooking Long Island Sound. People, when there's snow on the ground, they cross-country ski out here. And then, of course, you have the gardens by the Eola Mansion, the 42-room mansion that the Harknesses inhabited when they were alive. And now there's a very active group, the Friends of Harkness, and they help maintain the gardens. So it's a wonderful place to just hang out. When I say there's something fishy about Alewife Cove, this is the cove that forms the border between New London and Groton. And you're looking towards Ledge Light, so you're looking sort of southeast from Waterford Beach. On your left would be Ocean Beach, and on your right would be Waterford Beach. Alewife Cove refers to the small herring-like fish called an alewife. In different parts of the country, and even in Nova Scotia, it has different names. I think it's called the kiak. In Nova Scotia, it's called the lee, and in New Orleans, these small fish. And they called it an alewife because it was kind of chubby. It has a big round belly and a black spot on it, but the round belly was the thing because back in colonial times, at taverns were typically served by women bartenders, and most of them apparently were plump. So the Arboretum is at Connecticut College in New London, and there's another example of how community activists and the college community helped raise money to set aside this property and some adjoining parcels, and it's a great place to walk any time of year. And in the adjoining Mammacoke Island is also a great treasure, and it's one of the wonderful breeding or winter migrating grounds for shorebirds. You wonder where all the swans and other birds wind up. A lot of them hang out now and throughout the winter at Mamacoke Island. Our son Tom took this photo at top Lantern Hill. This is in Ledyard, right on the North Stonington border. It measures 491 feet in elevation, and if you look, we're looking sort of southwest from this point. If you look due south, you'd be looking out at, you can see the Mystic, and then across Long Island Sound, you can see Long Island, so you can see Connecticut, you can see New York. If you looked a little bit farther east, you'd see Watch Hill or Westerly, so you're seeing Rhode Island. If you turn around and look due north, you'd see probably the foothills in Massachusetts. And I suppose if you were really tall and if it were a really clear day, you might actually see into Vermont, but I'm not quite sure anyone can document that, and I'm not sure how you would prove it unless you had a big balloon or something. But it's a great spot. When I first moved to the area, this was owned by Ottawa Silica, which was a silica mining company, and it was common during the day you would hear this huge, you hear a whistle or a siren would go off, and a few seconds later there'd be this tremendous explosion and a crash of rocks tumbling down, big cloud of dust, and they were gradually tearing down the hill and using the silica. Lantern Hill is one of the purest outcroppings of quartz or silica anywhere in the world, and they were gradually tearing it down and using it for landscaping. It went into paint, it went into toothpaste, and a number of other industrial applications. But they finally stopped mining, and then about that time the tribe, Mashantucket Pequots, came along and they purchased it. And to their credit, they've kept it open to the public, and it's free for walking. There's wonderful trails. It's about a 20-minute walk from Winterchog Hill up to the summit. And it's also the start of the Narragansett Trail, which is about a 22-mile hike that goes into Rhode Island. So it's a wonderful place to view the whole countryside around. When I talked about the murmuration of swallows that Roger Torrey Peterson referred to, it really is a dazzling experience. There's a little boat launch site off of Route 156 called Pilgrim Landing, and it's in the town of Old Lyme. It's only about a mile north of the Baldwin Bridge if you get off at 156 in Old Lyme. And you can put a kayak or a canoe or a small boat, and it's less than a mile to only a few hundred yards north of there is Goose Island. And no one knows exactly why or for how long the swallows have been doing this, but right around sunset, from late summer through middle of fall, they all gather there. They're feeding on also migrating insects, and as many as 800,000 of these birds will come from all different directions, and it's an unbelievable experience just to sit in a kayak, or if you don't want to paddle or don't have access to a small boat like that, they also have tour boats out of Essex and elsewhere on the river that will take you there, and it's breathtaking to see. And it's different every night. I've been there many times, and sometimes they swirl around in a very nebulous pattern and just funnel to earth all at one whoosh. One thing that I haven't done, and every year I say I'm going to do it, and this year I promise myself I will, they do the exact opposite at dawn. So instead of all of them landing at once, they all take off at once. So but you should definitely put that on your list as something to do next summer. You'll never forget it. The Connecticut River also is a wonderful treasure, and this time of year, actually a little bit later, as the ice freezes farther north, the eagles migrate down from the Gulf of Maine, New Hampshire, Canada, and they follow the open water so they can continue to fish throughout the winter. And you can take a kayak, or they also offer tours, eagle watching tours from the same marinas that offer the the swallow watches. And I've seen as many as 20 or 30. Some of them are on ice floes like this. Some are in the air circling around. Some are roosting in trees. And there are also a couple of nesting pair now there. So it's very heartening to see that the birds are resettling in this area. I took a canoe trip many years ago, basically the length of the Connecticut River from near the Canadian border, 400 miles down to Old Saybrook, a 22-day voyage. And during that, and that was before the passage of the Clean Water Act, the establishment of the EPA, before the banning of DDT and so forth. And during that whole journey, not only did we see raw sewage and other industrial effluent flowing into the river, but we saw virtually no bird more exotic than a seagull. And now, as you can see eagles, you can see osprey, great blue heron, egrets, and all sorts of other birds. So it's very heartening to realize that nature will reclaim itself. Rocky Neck is, again, the next peninsula farther to the west. And this was another gamble that sort of paid off. This, the state back in 1929 was thinking about buying the land for a park, but the legislature just didn't want to spend the money. I think it was about $200,000 at the time. And so a group of 10 very civic-minded residents decided they would put up the money themselves with the expectation that the state eventually would come forward and reimburse them. So it was a bit of a gamble on their part, but the state eventually came through and preserved it. And Rocky Neck is a great place to hike. They have camping there too, as you know, and nice beaches. Rocky Neck also is an example, and I write about this in the book. There are two federal programs back in the 30s. They were Roosevelt era organizations, the CCC, which is the Civilian Conservation Corps, and the WPA, which is the Workers' Progress Administration. And during the Depression, when a lot of people are out of work, Franklin Roosevelt administration authorized money, and they hired a lot of young men from age 17 into their early 20s, and the WPA built that wonderful structure, that the pavilion there, but the CCC also cleared trails. They built the campground. They cut wood. They planted trees, and they did the same thing at Patchogue, and also at the next state park, also in East Lyme, in Old Lyme. So it was a wonderful organization. It makes you wish that our federal government would spend more money on those types of programs today. Tim Martin, one of our photographers, day photographers, took this pictures also at Rocky Neck. And again, this would have been an unusual sight not too long ago to see an egret there, certainly within our lifetime. So it's wonderful to see that these birds are making a comeback, or have made a comeback. Seals off of Fisher's Island. I see Bob in the audience, and he knows just about this time last year, we went out with a bunch of kayakers, and you can paddle out from right here in Groton. We leave from Esker Point in Noank. And seals migrate just like the same way that the eagles do. They migrate down from Maine and points north. And a big colony of them, 150 or more, wind up at Hungry Point on Fisher's Island, which is at the northeastern tip. And it's a great experience. I think Project Oceanology also, later in the winter, they offer some tours if you don't have access to a kayak or don't feel comfortable being out in cold water this time of year. There were federal regulations in terms of not getting too close to them, but not to worry because they jump into the water when they see you approaching. But they're naturally curious, and after you sit there just for a few minutes, they start popping up all around you. It's a bit of a challenge to try to photograph them. It's like playing whack-a-mole, because as soon as they see you aiming a lens at them, they dive back under. But if you paddle backwards, they kind of follow you, and I've follow you all the way back to Noank sometimes. And they sometimes show up in the Mystic River and all along the Connecticut coast as well. Ann Baldelli, one of our writers and also a wonderful photographer, took this image. This is on Rock Island in Stonington. Carl Charenson, a good friend, another good kayaker, and a fabulous photographer. He took a number of pictures in the book, and including this one. This is one of my favorites. And cormorants and the gull. If you're out there, it's important to stay upwind of any of those islands. As you can imagine, the guano stench is pretty overpowering, but it's still a magnificent sight. When I talk, this is the most recent preserve that Lyme acquired. It's called the Riverside Preserve. And again, when I say they set the standard, I mean there are other towns also throughout the region that are just as active. They do a very commendable job, as do many of the other towns, and they not just preserve it, but they maintain it. They offer educational programs, walks, and so forth. So it's not just setting aside so they can enjoy it themselves. It's really opening it up to everyone. This is Balancing Rock, which is in Salem. And this was also originally known as Smuggler's Rock. And back, there were always rumors that smugglers had buried treasure there. And back in the 40s or so, some kids were trying to dig for it or something, and the people were alarmed. They were afraid the kids were going to get hurt. And so they dynamited the cave. But luckily, the rock stayed intact. And the Salem Land Trust, which purchased the property not long ago, they're calling it Balancing Rock Preserve rather than Smuggler's Rock, so people don't think that they can sneak out there and dig around. Yantic Falls is in Norwich. People think of natural areas. You start to think about areas like Lyme or Ledyard or Stonington, which are less developed. But here in Groton, which has a number, of course, Bluff Point, Haley Farm, as well as its industrial areas, but other places like New London, which is heavily urbanized, as well as Norwich, also have set aside preserves. This is Uncas Leap, also known as Indian Leap, and it was the site of a battle between warring tribes. And there's different accounts of exactly what happened, and I'm not sure which is true. One account has Mianatonomo, one of the warring chiefs, being pursued by Uncas, who was the sachem of the Mohegans. And some of Mianatonomo and his tribe's people jumped into the rocks. Some of them died in the fall. Mianatonomo was wearing English armor, so they said, and he survived, but then he was later captured and executed. Anyway, that's kind of a grim story to tell about what a wonderful area this is. And the city, Norwich, also has the Rose Parade and Mohegan Park, so it's done its share of trying to preserve areas. The Avalonia Land Conservancy, formerly the Mashantucket Land Trust, this is their most recent acquisition. It's 450 odd acres, and it's right on the border of North Stonington, Griswold, and Preston. And this had been held for years and years by a Tennessee developer who initially proposed construction of several hundred housing unit development there. He finally was thwarted because he couldn't get financing, he couldn't get the necessary permits, and he finally sold it just this past year to the Avalonia Land Conservancy, which had applied to for numerous grants, but they also dug in to their own wallets, and it's a wonderful park. They just finished building some trails, and I've walked through there, and it's a great place to hike, but it's nice to have a nice green area that's left untouched. Desire Parker, anyone have any idea where this might be? Pawcatuck Cove, very good. It's if you're driving on Route 12 north from the submarine base towards Norwich, and you go through Gales Ferry and you're approaching the Preston border. You go over a little causeway and you'll see on your right a cove, and that's Pawcatuck Cove. There's a woman, and there's also wonderful trails there, but and there are two kayak and small boat launch sites there as well. But there's a woman named Desire Parker who back in the 1950s got a job at Electric Boat as one of the first women electrical engineers. But she also was sort of, she was a nature lover, and she would drive around and look at the countryside and fell in love with the area. And she was enamored of this cove, and she rented a rowboat and rowed around and saw this one beautiful little farm there. And so she went to the town hall, looked up the records, found out it was owned by a farmer named Maine, and said, knocked on his door unannounced, and he was a little suspicious, but he said, yeah, I came to look at your property, it's beautiful, would you ever consider selling it? And he said, well, as a matter of fact, I was thinking about selling it. What do you want? And she said, what do you want selling it for? And he said, $12,000. She said, I can't afford that. And he said, well, I'll tell you what, I'll hold the note for you, and you can pay it off in installments. And so and he said, but you got to give me your word that you're never going to develop it and you're never going to cut down this oak tree. And he says, I promise you that. And so she faithfully paid it off every month, earning a meager salary, but she lived alone. And in fact, I gave a talk not long ago at another library, and somebody in the audience said, hey, I remember that woman, because he grew up near there, and he says, some friends and I used to sneak around there in the woods, and she would come out and fire rock salt at him with a shotgun. So she was a little colorful. I met her in 1988, and that was a sort of a bittersweet occasion, because she had been in failing health for a number of years, and she realized she could no longer maintain the property by herself. And so she decided to give it to the Nature Conservancy. And that was the first major acquisition by the Nature Conservancy, which is in Connecticut. And it really put a beachhead for them in this state. And as some of you may know, it's an international organization, probably the largest wildlife or land conservation organization in the world. But here they purchased this property, and now it's a great place to hike. There's a beautiful trail that's accessed off of Avery Hill Road, or you can take your boat out from the boat launches off of Route 12. They're marked on various maps, and all because of her generosity and the fact that she wanted to keep it preserved, and she kept her promise to the farmer. My mother-in-law, Marilyn Brownell, took this photo of, this is off of Harkness, and again reinforces what a wonderful area that we live in, because we have farms, we have forests, we have the shoreline. And this is from Harkness, of course, looking out toward Long Island Sound. Kind of divided the book between water and land, and within land I talked about farms and how those are being preserved, as well as the land, the state parks and the nature preserves. This is this refers to the Oswegatchie Hills, which is on the East Lyme side of the Niantic River, and there's been an ongoing battle. In fact, there was a story on the front page the other day about it's still continuing. They were able to save several hundred acres and designate it as a nature preserve, but the developer from Middletown still trying to build houses on it. And they've made several offers. They can't come to terms. It's hard to say what will happen to the rest of it, but there's two very related groups, the Friends of the Oswegatchie Hills and Save the River, Save the Hills, two groups that are based, some in Waterford, some in East Lyme, that are working hard to try to keep it undeveloped. And it's another four-season resource. You can see people going snowshoeing and cross-country skiing here. It's wonderful hiking in the summer and fall and spring as well. This is the Beriah Lewis farm, which is in North Stonington, and it's right on the Rhode Island border. Beriah Lewis was a, well, actually before him, that was owned by Thomas Stanton. And he, back in 1791, he was arrested for breaking or burglarizing one of the local mills, and so a grist mill, I believe. And he was fined, he was sentenced to undergo like 40 lashes, flogging, as well as pay a $2,000 fine. So he took the flogging, but he couldn't afford the $2,000, and so he had to sell his property, and along came Beriah Lewis and paid the money, and he eventually expanded the farm. And today, it's now the 8th generation of the Lewis family continues to run the farm there. I talked to his great-great-great-great-grandson, Ledyard Lewis, and his brother, Ted. They continue to run the farm along with their families, and it's the largest, longest running family farm anywhere, dairy farm in Connecticut. Jack Tiffany was based in Lyme, and if any of you drive up north on Route 156, you'll see this wonderful hill as you're heading north towards Salem, and it's like a Currier and Ives scene. And he just died this past January, and I talked to his widow, Susan, in April, and asking what she was going to do with the farm. Well, their son is continuing to run it. She's still the owner of it. They sold their development rights to the state, meaning they can no longer, it can never be developed and turned into housing or any other commercial application. Unfortunately, they had to sell their dairy herd, so now they're focusing on beef cattle, but at least the farm is still remaining as a wonderful, undeveloped piece of land. He was a state legislator, by the way. That's his. Now, he had a kind of a quirky sense of humor, and that's when he was milking cows, and the cows would line up waiting to be milked. He was a state legislator, and running a farm, as you can imagine, was quite the challenge, and that's why a lot of them have gone out of business, because they can't compete with the larger operations in the Midwest and so forth. But one point, he couldn't afford his taxes, and they were going to foreclose on it, but somebody anonymously paid his taxes for him and allowed him to keep it. So there's a lot of community spirit and appreciating the value of farms. When I say squeezing a living out of the soil, I'm referring, of course, to the grapes that's grown. And this is the Morgan farm, which is on the road between, someone help me out here, between Shoeville Road and Lambton Hill Road. It's right near my house, and I'm drawing a blank. But in any case, it's they had dairy cows there until fairly recently. Henry Morgan was his grandfather had owned it. He died a few years ago. His son Richard continues to farm it, but now sold his dairy herd, and now they just grow grapes. Many of them are sold to the Stonington vineyards. This is in East Lyme. Some friends of mine, Butch and Mary Foster, and this is right near Scott's orchards. Scott's family owns a lot of orchards and vegetable farms and so forth, but Butch and Mary bought a little 16-acre parcel a number of years ago and determined to make a go out of it. And there's been a resurgence in small family farms in recent years, and it's heartening to see that that people are willing to. It's a tough life. You can't just be a farmer. He's also, he used to run a contracting business. He still plows the roads and digs foundations and so forth. But he plants trees and apple trees, and he has an apiary. He sells honey. His wife Mary bakes pies, and it's a real true mom and pop operation. And when I say good picking, it's a little play on words, because the barn that he built behind him is also on Sunday afternoons during harvest season. A bunch of musician friends get together there and hang out and play music. Anyone know where this is? Sandy Point. Very good. That's in Little Narragansett Bay. the Folly was there was a warehouse owner who purchased this back in the 1800s, and rumor has it that it was a liquor warehouse, and it was right on the border between Rhode Island and Connecticut. And whenever the inspectors from Connecticut came by, he moved all his inventory to the Rhode Island side. And then when the Rhode Island, he moved him back to the Connecticut side. But they eventually got wind of him and they shut him down. But the remnants of his, this was Rhodes. It was also called Rhodes Folly. So anyway, but it still stands there. It's a little bit of a navigational hazard, but it's also everybody who sails or kayaks or operates a small boat through there is very familiar with that. And it's near Sandy Point also, which is a kind of shifting sands I've written extensively about, and I have guest essays in the book about Sandy Point and how it originally had been connected to Napatry Point, and then it broke free during a storm, and then it continues to drift. It may eventually wind up in Stonington. It's sort of mostly in Rhode Island waters now, but it could wind up back in Connecticut at some point. And this is yours truly. This is on the Salmon River in Connecticut, right on the border of Colchester, East Hampton, and Marlborough. And this is another example of a wonderful area that had been very heavily built up back in colonial times and then through the 18th, 19th centuries with mills. Just virtually every waterway, and as you know, this region is just crisscrossed with lots of rivers and streams. There were dammed up for initially for grist mills, sawmills, and later in woolen mills. But when those shut down, some of them were built up, but most of them were turned over and are now like Salmon River, one of a tremendous state forest, and the Airline Trail. Some of you may have biked or hiked on. It's a wonderful trail. It's a former railroad line that goes from Colchester all the way to Willimantic. But this is the remnants of a dam, and you can go over it in springtime. It's a good little run there. And if this is probably the most challenging part, a little bit farther upstream, there's a nice 3-mile stretch of quick water, maybe class 1, class 2 or so. So if you're comfortable in it's a good introduction to white water, and you can easily portage the dam here. But I've had pretty good success. I think I'm batting about 900 in terms of not flipping over on this section. But it's not as bad as it looks because there's a nice pool. Even though it's a little chilly there, you can bail out in a pool. Anyway, one thing I neglected to do, which I can do now, and I'm going to turn the lights back on. This ends the visual portion of our presentation. But I wanted to read to you the introduction to the book. A few days after a town crew repaved the road in front of my house, I noticed a small bulge in fresh asphalt near the driveway. Must be a rock they missed, I mused. A day later, though, the bump, about the size of a golf ball, expanded. The following day, it grew even larger, as big as a grapefruit, and cracks began to appear. Finally, the next day, the pavement burst open, and the white cap of a mushroom emerged. It had pushed through several inches of hardened tar that I thought only a jackhammer could penetrate. I often think about that persevering mushroom when I visit some of the parks and nature preserves you'll read about and have just seen now in this presentation. Many of these properties had been extensively developed in the past, dotted with 19th century textile mills or 20th century beach cottages. For various reasons, the mills closed when much of the textile industry relocated to southern states. The Great Hurricane of 1938 wiped out many coastal neighborhoods. The now available land presented opportunities. In some instances, new buildings simply replaced abandoned or destroyed structures, but in other cases, forward-thinking individuals and organizations considered another option, preserving open space for the enjoyment and enrichment of future generations. It took hard work, determination, political support, and money to overcome resistance from real estate developers and other economic interests. But like that persistent mushroom, the groups refused to give in. They staged rallies, wrote letters to legislators, spoke at public hearings, held bake sales and other fundraisers, and eventually persuaded authorities as well as the public of the intrinsic and inspirational value of land conservation. And so trusts acquired new properties, the government created new parks, and people had new places to hike, paddle, or simply enjoy the silence and solitude. There's another aspect of mushroom power that I often reflect upon when visiting once developed properties converted to parks and preserves: the immutable and restorative force of nature. At first glance, we may view what appears to be a pristine forest, wilderness river, or unspoiled shoreline, but upon closer inspection, notice the remnants of old foundations, broken dams, smooth-over scars in the earth, and preponderance of second-growth trees. Slowly but surely, natural reclamation is hard at work. At the same time, dedicated environmentalists must not regard all development as unwelcome. We need houses and apartments to live in, stores to supply us with food, clothing, and other goods, factories, office buildings, and small shops for employment, schools, libraries, and other public buildings for a variety of services, and so on. But we also need open spaces, if for no other reason than to escape commercial, industrial, and residential sprawl. As celebrated naturalist, author John Muir observed, "Nature is always lovely, invincible, glad, whatever is done and suffered by her creatures. All scars she heals, whether in rocks or water or sky or hearts." Thank you.